Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to have you here. I'm really honored to be speaking at the National Library, a place where I've spent many, many hours sitting, having coffee with people, planning academic projects, and enjoying the collection. My only regret is that the National Library didn't send me a ticket to Israel for this event because everything is on Zoom. But I look forward to visiting again as soon as I can. My name is Don Seeman. I'm a professor at Emory University in Atlanta. And for many years, I've been doing anthropological research in and around the Ethiopian Jewish community, both in Ethiopia, mostly in Israel. I wrote a book called One People, One Blood, Ethiopian Israelis and the Return to Judaism, with Rutgers University Press in 2009, and various articles. And I'm currently working on a book, which I'll only tell you the title of right now, which is called An Ethiopian Jew Goes to Uman. And maybe it'll become clear why that's interesting as we go. I can't take questions probably during, because I just won't see them, but please do leave questions. And I will do my very best to answer them all at the end. Please turn up the volume, I'm told. Doron, is that something that you can do?
Just where we just lowered it a bit. You can go back to your toolbar near the mute button and press that arrow.
I have to do, okay.
And then go to audio settings and try to raise it. Try to eyeball it, no more than 90% or so.
I'm sorry, there's the audio settings. I'll try this once. And you'll let me know. Do you hear that ring?
No, I do not hear the ring. Do you want to try it without the microphone on your ears? Maybe that'll be louder.
There'll be background noise. There'll be background noise.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to get started. Thank you very, very much. I apologize if some of you have trouble hearing. I hope that won't be the case. I need to say at the outset, and I'll probably need to repeat it, are you generally people finding it too difficult to hear? One person just, no, okay, so that person may need to turn on their own volume. One thing I need to say at the outset, and we'll probably have to repeat again before the end, is that although I appreciate this invitation very, very much, I certainly don't claim to be the person in the world most qualified to talk about Chag HaSigd, the Ethiopian Jewish holiday or festival of the Sigd. There are in Israel both academic scholars, and some of whom are Ethiopian themselves, and Ethiopian rabbis and kesot, who can talk about this festival in a much more direct experiential way. So rather than try to compete with them or do what they might be able to do, I certainly don't want to see myself as speaking on behalf of the Ethiopian community, which is quite capable of speaking on its own behalf. I want to share some reflection. Yossi, it's very good to see you. I want to share some reflections about my years doing ethnography in this community, using the Sigd holiday as a frame to try to think about where Ethiopian Jews are in the world today. I don't mean geographically, and where they stand right now with respect to the rest of the people of Israel and the rest of the Jewish people at large. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Chag HaSigd is a distinctive Ethiopian Jewish holiday. It's not practiced by Jews anywhere else in the world. And again, in case you don't know, Ethiopian Judaism is also quite distinctive as compared to any other form of Judaism in the world. It's non-rabbinic. I won't call it pre-rabbinic because that's a more controversial way of framing things, but it's non-rabbinic. The rabbinic tradition was not active in Ethiopia, so there was no Talmud, no Mishnah, and none of the practices that go along with it. This was a Judaism that was framed primarily around the Torah, or Mikra, Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, with its own interpretations of how it should be read. And by the way, not in Hebrew. It was read in Giz, the sacred language of Ethiopia, out of a codex, a book rather than a scroll, as many of us are used to in our own synagogue. So Ethiopian Judaism is quite distinctive. And this has led over the years to a variety of both opportunities and challenges, some of which I'll talk about in a while with regard to the Sigd. The Sigd holiday was practiced once a year, a set number of days, I think 50 days after Yom Kippur, or the Ethiopian equivalent of Yom Kippur. Again, the Ethiopian Jews had a different calendar, which was related to the rabbinic calendar, but was different. Rabbi Reuven Iyasu in Israel has just put together a wonderful luach, or annual liturgical calendar of the Ethiopian community for the Ethiopian community's own use. And there you can see the comparison that he draws between the Ethiopian Jewish calendar, the Ethiopian Christian calendar, which is of course the dominant calendar in Ethiopia, the Gregorian calendar, which most of us in the West use, and the Hebrew calendar. The names of the months are different. So when I say 50 days after Yom Kippur, it should be understood that I'm talking about according to the Ethiopian calendar. This was a holiday which was characterized by ascending a mountain or a local hill, especially near the Ambover region, with prostration. Sig comes from language of prostration or prayer. And it was a time when the priests and the elders led the rest of the community in special prayers on behalf of their longing for Jerusalem. They read the book of Ezra Nehemiah, or parts of it. And in fact, they traced this holiday to the book of Ezra Nehemiah, which is interesting. I don't think rabbinic Jews have any holidays that are traced to the book of Ezra Nehemiah. I'm going to try to share with you right now an account of a woman who grew up in Ethiopia as she remembers the Sigd, to give a little bit of historical direction before going on to other things. Okay, I'm sharing with you right now, if I can. This is a text by...
I'm sorry, Professor,
I understand.
Okay.
Is that better? Okay.
No, the window you shared is the file searcher, so you need to close out of that and share the actual document.
Okay, I'm sorry. Technology. It doesn't seem to be given. Here we go. Okay, you should see a Hebrew text in front of you with a homegrown illustration. We're not going to read it through, but I want to make a couple of points. This is from a memoir by Rachel Yisachar, an Israeli citizen. It so happens that I purchased this book at the Chag HaSigd one year. I think it might have been 2010 or 2012. I'm not sure. And in this book, she recounts the very difficult journey of her family to Israel from Ethiopia in the 1980s. It's a harrowing book, and I very, very highly recommend it. I can't say how highly I recommend it. I think I have a copy. It's called Kocha Shel Emunah by Rachel Yisachar. Later, I'll show you the picture when I'm done screen sharing. She describes the Chag HaSigd as a time of prayer for the peace of Jerusalem, and bowing down on the ground and asking God for forgiveness from sins. It's related to Shavuot in the sense that just as Shavuot is 50 days after Passover, this holiday was 50 days after Yom Kippur, and it was related also to the idea of the giving of the Torah. Okay, there you see the mountain, the hill on which the Sigd was practiced in Ambover. And she describes the priests and the elders leading all of the people with singing and prayers up to the mountain, the children lagging behind, the elders going ahead, and then having a full prayer service at the top. She writes, Kol haderech sharu kesim shirei tefillah v'ga'aguim Yerushalayim. The priests were singing songs of longing for Jerusalem the whole time, ואחרי חצי שעה החלו לטפס במעלה ההר. And then after about a half an hour, they would start going up the mountain. מי שהתקשה, קשישים, נשים, הרות, חולים, נכים, או ילדים קטנים, נעזור באחרים. And anybody who had trouble walking up the mountain because they were old or pregnant or injured or sick in some way would be helped up the mountain by other people. Hold on, I'm just closing that out. Okay. And this was a full day event, which is still remembered in Ethiopian memory as being one of the highlights of Ethiopian Jewish life. One of the highlights of Ethiopian Jewish life. She writes, and I'm there in the left corner on the bottom, I remember, she says, I remember my excitement during the time of prayer and when the blessings were recited, because I knew that these prayers would be fulfilled. In other words, we would one day walk in Jerusalem. I would close my eyes. She's speaking here as a young girl. Umirimat roshi, chasha be'emet shani krova l'shamayim ve'elohim liyadi. And I would think about the fact that here on the top of the hill, I'm close to heaven, and God is near me. And I would speak to God everything that I desired and everything that I felt. I would feel on the top of this mountain free of everything that held me down, every difficulty. I read that already. And I waited eagerly every year for the coming of the holiday. So this is not the kind of account an anthropologist would normally be able to write. This is an account of a woman who lived this holiday in her own childhood, and this is what it meant to her. And of course, as the Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, became more and more of a reality over the decades, and her family eventually left in the 1980s. There are still some families coming now. That's a more complicated story, probably won't get into today. But as the Shivat Zion came closer and closer, so you can only imagine that these prayers on the top of Har HaSigd in Ambover or outside Ambover would have been especially powerful for people to think about because their lives were directed towards getting to Jerusalem. And that's what this holiday was about. I also want to point out something that my good friend, Rabbi Sharon Shalom, also points out in some of his books. He's a rabbi who was born in Ethiopia. He might be here now, I'm not sure. And he writes that Ethiopian Judaism was characterized by a very deep sense of personal connection with God, speaking to God, singing to God in a very personal, existential way. He says that's one of the reasons that some Ethiopians in Israel are drawn to Hasidut, which is something maybe we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit later. It's not the image we usually have of Ethiopian Judaism from the outside. Because as is normal, those of us who are not Ethiopians are drawn to the music that we're not familiar with, the colors of the outfits that we're not familiar with, the sounds and the sights and the smells that we're not familiar with. And the inner heart of Ethiopian Judaism is something that we might miss. Okay, so that's her account. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this now. So we have longing for Jerusalem, prostration. It's a special Beta Israel practice. In other words, it wasn't practiced by Ethiopian Christians. And by the way, I should say something about this town, the town of Ambover, outside of which the hill that we just saw in the photograph was located. Ambover was probably the largest Ethiopian Jewish town up through the 1980s. Friends of mine who left that village or its satellite villages in the 1980s described the desolation as they sort of marched out one group at a time, secretly in the middle of the night over a course of weeks, leaving nothing but their animals, which they couldn't take with them. There's a theme of the dog that was left behind, chained to the hut, waiting for somebody new to enter the village to take over the livestock. A scene of great desolation, but also great hope. because these were people who were taking their fate in their hands in a very dangerous time, the 1980s, and walking to Jerusalem. Many of them didn't make it. And Rachel Yisachar's memoir, and there are other memoirs, Shmuel Yilma, others, is a very good source for this. If you read Hebrew, take a look at Kocha Shel Emunah by Rachel Yisachar. It's maybe one of the most moving of the memoirs that I've read, although there are others. There are quite a few. Shmuel Yilma's is also translated into English, and so forth and so on. The town itself of Ambover, though, was not a very old Ethiopian Jewish town. The town of Ambover was settled in the early 20th century. I don't even know how many Ethiopian Jews are aware of this today, by a group of Beta Israel, or Ethiopian Jews, who were leaving their home elsewhere to look for a place that the missionaries had not yet reached. British missionaries, the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Amongst the Jews, arrived in Ethiopia in the 1860s. They made some inroads, and many of the pious who didn't want to be sort of in their sights would actually get up and migrate, pick up their houses and move to other places. That's how the town of Ambover got started. It got started by people who just wanted to be out of the way of the missionaries, and gradually grew into the largest Ethiopian Jewish town. Later on, it was visited by Jewish visitors to Ethiopia, most important of which was Jacques Beitlovich from France, originally from Poland, who came to Ethiopia for the first time in 1904. And this is important because what I want to argue is that there are basically three different periods in the history of the Sigd. I'm not talking about its ancient history, I'm talking about its modern history, which are worth talking about. Okay, of course, there was the Chag HaSigd before there was contact with Westerners, and we know about that only through oral history, so I'm not going to say so much about it now. I am going to share a screen with one picture, just so you have something more pleasant to look at. Just a moment. Do you see a picture now, or you just still see my?
Not yet.
Okay, sorry about that. Technology. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I don't want to get too interrupted. The Chag HaSigd, after the time of contact between Ethiopian Jews and non-Ethiopian Jews, became a site for reflection upon the relationship between Ethiopian Jews and others. Do you see a photograph now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry. There, I'll make it full screen. This is an image of the Chag HaSigd as it was practiced in Jerusalem in the early 2010s. I like this picture very much because it shows that I had a very good seat, which was not easy to get. I had to stand on line for a long time. And I happened to be sitting right behind the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, the Rishon LeZion, and Rabbi Hadana, who for many years was known as the chief rabbi of the Ethiopian community. And they're sitting overlooking the days of the Kesim, the Kesot, the Kahanat, the Ethiopian Jewish priests, who are standing behind the days and singing their beautiful, beautiful liturgy. And there'll also be some speeches, of course, but it's mostly prayer. And if you can imagine this, behind them is the old city of Jerusalem. They are standing here on the Tayelet. That has an English name, I don't remember what it was. They're standing on the Tayelet overlooking the old city of Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, and it's an incredible vista. They have their backs to the old city, but from the audience, that's what you see. And you see this incredible diversity of colors and shapes and sounds, beautiful chanting, and people of all walks of life. And one of the things I love about this picture is the difference in outfits. or uniforms that you see among the different people who are there. So if you take a look at the Ethiopian priests standing in the background, you'll see them with white turbans, colorful cloaks. Many of them, it's hard to see here, are carrying colorful umbrellas against the sun, but it's also a status symbol. Many of them have fly swatters made out of a zebra tail or a giraffe tail, which is also a sign of status. They have the book of the Orit, the Torah, in front of them. When I was there that day, they also had a Sefer Torah, right, a Torah of the kind that rabbinic Jews are used to using, and they read some from there. And they're sort of facing the kihila, or the community, and directing their prayers. And if you look to the side from where this picture is, you see many, many, many people, both men and women, standing with their hands raised or rocking with their hands like this, sort of absorbing the spirituality of the prayer, listening to it, saying Amen at all the right places, especially the elders who knew these prayers from their youth. Many of the younger people don't know these prayers because they didn't grow up with them in Israel. And so there are a lot of other social activities taking place often at the same time. But then in the foreground, you have, first of all, the Rishon LeZion, the Sephardi chief rabbi, in his traditional garb. And then you have Rabbi Hadana wearing the black hat and jacket of the Lithuanian yeshiva world. And what's quite interesting about this is here you see three different assumptions being made about Ethiopian Jewry, all of which are true in their own way. On the one hand, the Sephardi chief rabbi was there and spent the whole day there rather than the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, not out of any bad feelings, I think. I've seen the Ashkenazi chief rabbi at other Ethiopian events. Maybe we'll have a chance for some pictures. But because it's generally assumed that in Israel's it's not really a melting pot, sort of the salad bowl of Israel, it's assumed that Ethiopian Jews somehow fall under the Sephardic rubric and not under the Ashkenazic rubric, even though the claim can easily be made that Ethiopian Judaism is more different from both Sephardic and Ashkenazic Judaism than either of them are from each other. In other words, it's really its own thing. But in the sort of bicameral division of religious authority in Israel, they tend to fall under the authority of the Sephardi chief rabbinate, largely because of cultural reasons, because they're from Africa, because they are people with large families and a very traditional way of life when they came to Israel. And somehow or other, it seemed to make sense to put them there. Although the very fact that this holiday is progressing, that the Chag HaSigd is being practiced in Israel, and these are traditional kesim or priests offering the traditional prayers, in fact shows that this is something different than Sephardic Judaism as it was known in Morocco or Tunisia, or any of those other places where most Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews came from. Rabbi Hadana came to Israel much earlier than most Ethiopians. He studied in yeshivot. He became a rabbi, maybe the first Ethiopian rabbi in Israel. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think it's true. His father was a very important kes, sometimes called the leader of the kes in Ethiopia, or at least in a particular region of Ethiopia. I'm sorry that Kes Hadana passed away not long ago, and his memory should be for a blessing. But Rabbi Hadana was for many years the face of the Ethiopian community vis-a-vis the Israeli rabbinate and vis-a-vis the Israeli Orthodox community. And he's sitting here speaking with the chief rabbi. He has a very honored place on the dais, but he's not at the dais offering the traditional prayers. And that's because a kes and a rabbi are not exactly the same thing. They're both spiritual leaders of different segments of the Ethiopian Jewish community, maybe spiritual leaders of the whole Ethiopian Jewish community together, because things are not quite so bifurcated, but they have completely different training. Rabbi Hadana was trained in Israeli-style Judaism, leading the Israeli prayers and fulfilling the mitzvot as they are rabbinically understood, and has played a very, very important role as a culture broker as Ethiopians came to Israel and became Israeli and settled down as Jews in Israel. But the Kesim never lost their distinctive identity. And so there's both friendliness and respect we see here. Both Rabbi Hadana and the chief rabbi are given the respect of having an honored place in the front of the crowd. They're showing respect to the kesim for coming, but it's clear that they have different practices, almost different religious orientation. And one of the fascinating things about the Ethiopian community today is the way the Sigd becomes a place for the performance of these various differences, okay, these various differences. Now, one thing that you can't see in the picture, but that I find very fascinating, is that this may have been the first Sigd that I was in. I haven't been able to go every year. This was around 2010, I think. This is the first Sigd that I was at in which the kesim, who you see there in white, had small sons or grandsons standing behind them, running around under the dais, learning the prayers, being inducted into the Khanat, into the priesthood. And, when I began my work in the Ethiopian Jewish community in the 1980s, nobody thought that was going to happen. I say this not to be controversial, but because it's true. I circulated very widely back then, both among academics and in the Ethiopian community, and it was widely assumed that sort of traditional Ethiopian religion of this kind would persist for a generation, maybe two, but would be replaced by Israeli rabbinic Judaism, whether it's Orthodox or Masorti, but that they would sort of blend into the general Mizrahi, Masorti, or Dati crowd in Israel. But one of the astounding things, and for me, very interesting and very happy things over the last 2 decades, I would say, not more, has been the resurgence of Ethiopian traditional religion. And the fact that the kesim are now inducting their children and grandchildren here at the Sigd is an important sign of that. Okay? Now, remember, I said that I was going to talk about 3 different periods in the history of the Sigd. So I talked about, well, maybe 4. I talked about the first one before contact with Western Jews and Christians, which was just a seamless part of Ethiopian Jewish life. The second period begins after contact with Western Jews and Christians. Christians mostly starting in the 1860s, contact with Western Jews not really beginning in earnest until the early 20th century. Remember, Feitlovich goes to Ethiopia in 1904. He's not the first, but he's the first one who stays. And Feitlovich makes it his business over the rest of his life to do 2 things. First, he tries to drum up support for Ethiopian Jews among Jews elsewhere, in Europe, in North America. He travels around the world, he collects money, but not only money, he collects signatures of famous rabbis. There's a famous letter with 100 rabbis signing in support of Ethiopian Jewry, sending them money, sending them books, sending them things that they might need. And at the same time, in Ethiopia, drumming up support for the idea that the Beta Israel are not just their own religious community destined one day to return to Jerusalem, but that they are part of this international Jewish community, most of whom are not Ethiopian, most of whom are not African. And this was not something that most Beta Israel knew before the 1860s. They had their practices and their religions and their dreams and their hopes, but first contact narratives by both Jews and Christians often start off with the Beta Israel being surprised. Oh, look, as one of these narratives says, white falasha from across the sea have come to us. And Christians use this to their advantage because they would present themselves as Jews, as white Jews. Many of them were born as Jews, but had become Christian missionaries, people like Henry Aaron Stern from the London Society. And once they were accepted as Jews, they would begin preaching not only the Hebrew Bible, of course, but the New Testament. And when the priests realized what was going on, they often had very violent reactions. Some people did convert to Christianity. Many people moved away. There were episodes of violence, and that's a long history of its own, which you can read about in my book if you'd like. In chapter 2, I think is where it mostly is. It's Stephen Kaplan at Hebrew University has written a lot about this period. Others have written a lot about this period. But this begins a period of rapprochement, I would say, between Ethiopian Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism as practiced elsewhere. And when I say rapprochement, I don't actually mean that they were once upon a time doing the same thing. I mean that they begin to move more closely together. And most of the movement, it has to be said honestly, comes on the part of the Ethiopians who were learning about Judaism in the rest of the world. This is the period in which you begin to see Jewish stars appearing on Ethiopian synagogue. That was a symbol that wasn't known before contact with the West. You begin to see Torah scrolls popping up, and not just the traditional Giz language codex of the Bible. You begin seeing Hebrew words introduced into the liturgy, into speech, and you begin having visitors, both from Palestine and later from Israel, from North America, from Europe. Feitlovich goes about choosing some Ethiopian young people, sending them off to Jewish schools outside of Ethiopia, in Cairo, which was at that time a very big Jewish community before 1948, or in Italy, even in Germany. And the goal of these, I think they were all young men, was that they would learn about Judaism and about the world outside, and then they would come back and become teachers and help their people to mediate that bridge, or to bridge that gap between Ethiopian life and world Jewish life, I would say, and what eventually becomes Israeli Jewish life after 1948. This wasn't easy. Ethiopian Jews in the early 20th century widely practiced animal sacrifice. Okay? This has not been widely practiced in Rabbinic Judaism for millennia. They widely practiced rules of tumah v'tahara, of purity and impurity, which for the most part have not been observed by Rabbinic Jews for generations upon generations. They were living a life that was much more in accord in some ways with the literal meaning of the biblical verses. They had the Saturday Sabbath, but by the way, their Saturday Sabbath was much stricter than the Rabbinic Saturday Sabbath. Not only you're not allowed to light a fire, but you were not supposed to have a fire lit from before the Sabbath. And that meant no hot food of any kind. And the penalty for Sabbath violation, I don't know whether it was ever carried out, but in formal terms, the penalty was death. And without many of the fine distinctions that rabbinic halacha makes, my friend Sharon Shalom has written a lot about this in his book, From Sinai to Ethiopia, which is available both in Hebrew and in English, and I highly recommend it. Rabbinic Judaism is filled with nuance and minutiae of details that have been argued about and written about by rabbis for 2,000 years. And Ethiopian Judaism, while it does have an oral tradition, has a much more simple one that stays much closer in some ways to the biblical text. So animal sacrifice, purity and impurity. They did not practice mitzvot that Rabbinic Jews consider biblical, like tzitzit or tefillin, in exactly the way that Rabbinic Jews do. And so Feitlovich understood that if this community was going to eventually migrate to Eretz Yisrael, as he understood from early on, he believed that they would have to make changes to accommodate Rabbinic Judaism. And this led to great tension within the Beta Israel community. Some Ethiopian Jews were eager to undergo those changes. Some were adamantly opposed, traditionalists. A few became Christian. And of course, there were different varieties in between each of these. So in this model, the Sigd takes on the valence of a traditional Ethiopian Jewish holiday, which may or may not continue. Many, many traditional Ethiopian practices have generally discontinued in Israel. Ethiopian Judaism knows many, many more fast days than most Rabbinic Jews practice today. By the way, Ethiopian Christianity also knows many more fast days than most other Christian groups. Outside of some people, maybe some elders and priests, Those have fallen into disuse. Most Israeli Ethiopians today follow the Hebrew calendar. If they're observant, they observe the Hebrew calendar fast days, the 17th of Tammuz, rather than 17 days before Tisha B'Av, as was the Ethiopian custom. The Hebrew calendar has in many, many, many ways replaced the Ethiopian calendar, and which means that even the holidays are not necessarily observed on the same day that they would have been observed in Ethiopia. And every Ethiopian Jewish leader that I've spoken to, including the most traditional, has been okay with that. I don't know of any major attempt to try to revive the Ethiopian liturgical calendar. I think that most Ethiopian Jews feel, if there's somebody here who feels otherwise, they're welcome to say so, but most historically have felt that they wanted to be part of the global Jewish people and understood that that would require some changes. There's no animal sacrifice in Israel. In Israel, it's almost impossible for women and men to separate physically, to live under different roofs during a woman's menstrual cycle, as they did in Ethiopia. This was very traumatic for some new immigrants who came to Israel, and it's been an ongoing process. But I would say that from 1904 through the 1980s, that was the process. It was the process of, let's not call it rapprochement, let's call it accommodation, in which Ethiopian Jewry made both self-conscious and less self-conscious choices to better align it with Judaism outside of Ethiopia. And Jews outside of Ethiopia gradually came to accept Ethiopian Jews as kith and kin. Okay? Neither side, by the way, assumed that the other was kith and kin at the very beginning. That was a process that took time. They had different religious practices. They hadn't had contact of any major way for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not surprising that there was some tension. Are we the same people? Can we intermarry? Do we practice the same religion? What does this look like? In 1948, the State of Israel was created. This led to a lot of hope among Beta Israel to migrate. The State of Israel for the first 30 years was not very interested in helping them migrate. Some of you may remember that at one time, Iran and Turkey and Ethiopia were Israel's great allies against the Arab world. They were non-Arab countries in the Middle East. Now that seems to be flipping on its head. Iran, Turkey, not so much Ethiopia. But at the time, Israeli diplomats did not want to upset Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, who claimed Ethiopian Jews as his own people, and certainly did not want to witness any mass exodus, which might look bad for the kingdom or for his government or something like that. He was happy to let students leave with the understanding that they would come back and use their skills in Ethiopia, but there was no talk of permitting a mass emigration. And the State of Israel, which was controlled during most of that period by the Ma'arach, the Labor Party, was pretty unified behind that position. The position was that Beta Israel are not officially Jews, and therefore the law of return was not applied to them. That was Rabbi Herzog's ruling in 1950 or 1951. And therefore, up through the 70s, it was easier to get a tourist visa to Israel if you were an Ethiopian Christian who wanted to visit the holy site than if you said you were an Ethiopian Jew. Some did. There were training programs at Ort and other places, but there was really no stomach in Israel for a mass immigration. Although there were a few Ethiopians who snuck onto kibbutzim and stayed there. Some even fought in the '73 war. But these were very, very small numbers. The period of accommodation lasted through the 1980s. And what happened in the 1980s, of course, was two things. Political revolution in Israel. Menachem Begin is swept to power. The beginning of Sephardic power, of Shas, of the influence of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef upon Israeli society, which for many veteran Israelis who were Ashkenazim was a considerable shock to their system. And with that, a change in attitude towards Ethiopian Jews. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef ruled in 1973, and he was later followed by Rabbi Goren, his Ashkenazi chief rabbi counterpart, that Beta Israel are Jews who fall under the law of return. And armed with that rabbinic ruling, Menachem Begin began very quickly to upon coming to power, to try to begin to organize an exodus of Ethiopians from Ethiopia. It might be a myth, I don't know, but he's reported to have said to the head of his Mossad, Havuli et Ethiopian, right, bring me the Ethiopians. And this set in motion processes, which we can't even talk about right now, which eventually lead to the secret operations of Operation Moses in 1984 and 85, and related operations. The first 8,000 or so Ethiopian Jews come to Israel. And here's where things change. Upon arriving in Israel, there was a small Ethiopian Jewish population already in Israel, but on arriving in Israel in the 1980s, Ethiopian Jews found, to their consternation, that in order to be recognized as Jews under halakha, which of course in Israel has political ramifications, right? I mean, whether your identity card says Yehudi or not, under Le'om, under the national heading, that in order to be recognized as Jews, they would have to undergo some form of conversion to Judaism. And this has been a moving target. At one time, the rabbinate was looking for complete conversion. Later, under severe protest, they dropped the requirement for symbolic recircumcision. They required only immersion in a mikvah. This was met by steadfast Ethiopian protest. And throughout the mid-1980s, there were really only two issues that fired up the Ethiopian community. One was their relatives who were still trapped in Ethiopia, and the other was fighting against the Rabbanut. Not everybody was fighting. The Ethiopian community itself was split, but their public stance was of resistance. And in this context, the Kesoch took on a very different role than they would subsequently take. In the north of Israel in the 1980s, I attended weddings performed by Kesoch, and they would say openly that this was their act of resistance. Ethiopians were getting married outside of the rabbinate because the rabbinate required conversion, and the rabbinate also didn't recognize the priests as capable of officiating at a wedding. So there was a lot of resistance. It was considered a problem both by proponents and by opponents. But this is the context in which many people thought that traditional Ethiopian Judaism was a survival. It was a thing of the past. It would die out as the older generation of priests died. And those young Ethiopians who chose to be religious, of course, not all in Israel do, but those who chose to be observant would find their place somehow within that spectrum of Dati, Masorti, that everybody in Israel knows. Okay? This picture doesn't reflect that, right? The idea of the chief rabbi and of an Ethiopian rabbi in a black hat sitting in a place of honor, listening to the priests do their prayers and the priests honoring them, probably was not possible. I think was not possible in the mid-1980s and even throughout the 90s because of this struggle, which took many different forms and had many different permutations. At one point, the chief rabbinate said that only Rabbi Shlush from Netanya, he was the chief rabbi of Netanya, he was a Yemenite, who happened to believe, he followed the psak that Ethiopians should be considered Jewish. He was willing to marry them. And so the chief rabbinate sort of shunted it aside and said, any Ethiopian who wants to get married in the rabbinate has to go to Netanya and get a marriage license. Most Israelis go to their local Misrad Datot to get a marriage license. This went on for a number of years. But over time, things changed in a few different ways. Okay, and that brings us to the third historical period that I'm going to finish by talking about in the next 10 minutes or so, which is the period now, which I call the Ethiopian Jewish Renaissance. The Ethiopian Jewish Renaissance is not one thing. It's the flowering of many, many, many different types of Ethiopian Jewish life in Israel, with a new self-confidence, with comfort in Israel and in Hebrew culture, and also in the desire to decide how they want to relate to traditional Ethiopian culture. There are now dozens of Ethiopian rabbis, young rabbis who were trained in Israel, went to yeshivot in Israel, who are recognized by the Rabbanut for performing weddings and other functions. And some of them don't only serve the Ethiopian community. Some of them serve non-Ethiopian Israelis the same way that a rabbi of Yemenite descent serves not only Yemenites, but other Jews in Israel as well. My friend Sharon Shalom, just to keep on mentioning him, is the rabbi of an Ashkenazi shul in Kiryat Gat, a shul that was composed mostly of Holocaust survivors. And that generation of rabbis has infused the Ethiopian community with its own leadership. The idea that it doesn't have to go to non-Ethiopian rabbis for guidance all the time. And to be perfectly honest, the Ethiopian rabbinic leadership is also split into a more Haredi and a more Dati Le'umi aspect. So there are Ethiopian rabbis of the Shas model. There are Ethiopian rabbis of the Har Etzion model, that's inside baseball for Orthodox Jews in the room. But Ethiopian rabbis are not all of one cut. There's even one Ethiopian conservative rabbi, as far as I know, who's been around for a number of years. But at the same time, Ethiopian Jewish secular culture has taken off, and Ethiopian traditional Jewish culture has taken off in ways that couldn't be imagined before. A number of years, the Sigd holiday used to be organized. I'm going to share a different picture. Used to be organized by various secular leadership organizations. Today, it is organized by the organization of the Kesoch. Do you see a picture there of a few men in black hats at a synagogue? Do you see that? Okay, this is the dedication of an Ethiopian Jewish synagogue in Jerusalem that I was privileged to be at. There you see the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rabbi Lau, speaking with the rabbi of the new synagogue. That's Rabbi Hadana, who we've already met, sitting on the end. And it's an Israeli synagogue like other synagogues, except that when you go there on Shabbat morning, they have both Hebrew services and Amharic services, or they did at least several years ago when I was there. And the rabbi, at this time, this was Rabbi Shachar, had relationships with Ethiopian priests, some of whom were his own age, who would come to the synagogue to teach and to do ritual events. So the ability of an Ethiopian Jew to live both in rabbinic Jewish culture and in Ethiopian Jewish culture at the same time, and in secular Israeli culture, if they choose to, is something that is new, that wasn't there before. And the Chag HaSigd has followed suit. There really is another picture that I want to show you. See if I can find it. Here you see the Hebrew Amharic Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, from this Ethiopian synagogue, right? It can be followed. You can follow the services both in Hebrew or in Amharic. I should point out that you would never have seen a book like this in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the Torah was written in Ge'ez. This is a modern Amharic translation. So this is something that you really only would find in Israel. Let me stop that share as well. There was a different share that I really wanted to show. Let's see if I can find it. Oh. Okay, you see a picture with some women dancing?
No, let's see the file Explorer again.
Okay, sorry, give me a moment. There you go. Now you see it? Okay. Yes. So I have some friends on the line. You will recognize my good friend Avital there. But these are young Ethiopian Israeli girls. If you notice the sign in the back, it is Chag HaSigd. This is the Sigd 1 year in a town, I think in the north of Israel, where it's a school holiday. And here you see Ethiopian Jewish children coming to be inducted to some degree into Ethiopian culture. But they're here as observers, first of all. The women on the stage, led by Avital. Avital was working, I think, for an organization that promoted traditional Ethiopian Jewish culture and language. And they're teaching traditional Ethiopian dances and wearing traditional Ethiopian costumes, which the children, if you notice, are not. If you also notice, there are not only Ethiopians in the frame, I don't know if you can see them, but there are some non-Ethiopian kids. In other words, this is a school that happens to have a large Ethiopian population, but it's not an Ethiopian school, it's an Israeli school with different kinds of Israelis. And they're all coming to participate in the Chag HaSigd activities. And those activities involve not just priests intoning the prayers, but also cultural revival activities. Music, dance, arts, crafts. It's really burgeoning. In fact, to such an extent that some of the more pious have been uncomfortable. And I'll give you two examples. First of all, you know, there are two Sig celebrations in Jerusalem every year. One is the one we saw at the Tayelet. There's another at the Kotel. I'm not going to get into the various political splits right now, but one of the arguments they have is about which one is more pious, I guess, more religious. There are also some geographical differences in the people. I also met an Ethiopian Jew who went for Rosh Hashanah to Uman, to the grave of Rabbi Nachman, and considers himself a student of Bratslav Hasidism, who said that he became disenchanted with the Sig because it became a huge social event. Of course, that's ironic a little bit because the same can be said of the pilgrimage to Uman, but it is true about the Chag HaSigd. And if you go there, you'll see lots and lots of socializing going on with teenagers and young people, drumming, selling of wares. It's a festival, not just a religious holiday. It's become a cultural festival. And like every ethnic cultural festival in Israel, the politicians show up, they give speeches, they try to get support. One year, the prime minister came, which was terrible because security was awful and it was hard to get in. And so they disinvited him the next year. But the minister of absorption usually comes. He has less security. A chief rabbi usually comes. Some other Chaver Knesset usually comes. Now there are Ethiopian Chaver Knesset who come. There are Ethiopian dignitaries, sometimes from the Ethiopian embassy in Jerusalem, who make an appearance. Sometimes television and radio personalities, Rachamim Elazar and others from the old guard, who make appearances. And so this is both a religious and a cultural and a political event, just like other Israeli holidays. Some of you know that, I don't remember what year it was, but just in the last few years, the Sigd has actually been adopted as part of the official Israeli calendar, which means if you take a look at the Israeli calendar, it's marked there. Schools are supposed to do some sort of commemoration of Chag HaSigd. It's become in some ways the Ethiopian Maimuna. If you think about the Maimuna of the Moroccan Jews, the day after Passover, which has now become a general Israeli festival. You don't have to be Moroccan to participate at all, to set up a barbecue and eat bread after Passover. And the Chag HaSigd has not quite yet achieved that status in Israel, but there are people who would like it to. And this is what I'm going to conclude with. The Ethiopian Jewish community today in Israel is at a crossroads, and the Chag HaSigd reflects that. There are various choices that individual members of the community have to make. Some will opt for mainstream Israeli society, whatever that means exactly. Often identifying in some way as secular, although there are fewer Ethiopians who call themselves secular than in the general population, or Masorti in some way, as many other Mizrahim do. Some will be Orthodox, whether that means Dati Leumi or Haredi, Haredi-ish, at least. There's a problem in that the Ashkenazi Haredim, for the most part, don't accept Ethiopian Jews, so it's harder for them. But in the Sephardic Haredi community, they have the Gushbanka of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and you can't do better than that. Shas has Ethiopians involved in it. And some, increasingly, are opting to also incorporate traditional Ethiopian Judaism. The same family may call for a priest to slaughter a goat for them for a family celebration, That meat is not usually considered kosher under rabbinic standards because there are some differences in the way the meat is slaughtered, although some Ethiopians are trained in both, right, and can be licensed in both, but they need not be. And if you go to an Ethiopian wedding or a bar mitzvah or a celebration, still today, very often you'll have a big pot of stew with a goat that was slaughtered on behalf of the family by a kes who showed up that morning. And they will have separate store-bought meat for the non-Ethiopian visitors who may want it. And for some of the Ethiopian younger people who would rather have schnitzel than sigawat. So there's an incredible moment right now for the merging and flourishing of different traditions in ways that we really can't see how they're going to wind up. There will be Ethiopian breast lovers. There are Ethiopian breast lovers. There will be more. There will be Ethiopian Chabadnikim, and there will be more. There will be Ethiopian Shasnikim. There will be more. There's no reason to think of that as something bad. These are people who have joined Israeli society and are making their own choices. There will be modern Orthodox Ethiopians. There will be secular Ethiopians. There will be Masorti Ethiopians. There will be Ethiopian Jews in every single walk and aspect of Israeli life, in the ranks of the army and in the ranks of the government and the civil service. A friend of mine from the Ethiopian community is now the Israeli consul, I think in Chicago. She just arrived. Ethiopian Jews are now part of everything. And that's what they should be. In other words, people should be able to make their own choices. And anytime a non-Ethiopian sort of looks and tisks and says, oh, wouldn't it be better if they were still sort of doing what they did on postcards in the 1950s? I say, well, you're not doing what your ancestors were doing in the 1950s or in the 1850s. And Ethiopian Jews today are Israelis, a few Canadians, a few Americans, but mostly Israelis, just like everybody else. And for me, it's a very, very exciting time. And for me as an anthropologist, it's a time that I just want to get in there and dig in and find out how people are seeing themselves. And I hope that Chag Sigd is something that everybody finds an opportunity at some point to experience and celebrate for themselves, whether it's in a local community, like in this picture, or whether you visit the Tayelet in Jerusalem. It's on the calendar now. So all you have to do is look, and you will find. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank especially my friends in the Ethiopian community, not just for showing up, but for making this part of my life over 30 years and more in a very, very profound way. And I hope to publish more, and you'll be seeing more. But I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Professor. The first question is regarding the Orit. There's a beautiful Orit at the National Library of Israel, which I know was brought over by one of the Kesim and wanted to give it to the Rabbanut, but they didn't have anywhere to hold on to it. So they gave it to the National Library so that it becomes a treasure for the entire Jewish people. It's also covered in a beautiful, colorful cloth, which represents the priests in Beit HaMikdash. I know, though, that there are differences between the Orit and the Tanakh, or the Torah.
Yeah.
And I know that the Orit were held by families. They were different. There were several Orit.
Do you see a picture right now of a young man with a book?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if he's here. This is my friend Sharon Shalom. He didn't know that he was going to be made famous. He's actually Rabbi Dr. Sharon Shalom, and has a PhD from Bar Ilan University and a shul at an academic position. And this is his home in Kiryat Gat, where I visited him a number of years ago. And he's holding his family Orit. This is his grandfather. His grandfather was an important kes in the Tigray region. And this is the Orit that was passed down by his grandfather. He's holding there, if you see a red leather pouch, that was the pouch that his grandfather carried this in all over the place, and in which it was carried to Israel. And it's a beautiful book. I'm sorry I can't get a closer up of the image. I didn't have a very good camera at the time. But yes, there are many families who are still holding copies of the Orit, and there was just a very nice donation to the National Library, which I haven't had a chance to see in person yet. The Orit is different than the rabbinic Torah in a couple of ways. Most obviously, as you see, it only appears in book form. It's not in a scroll. Second of all, it's written in Gez, as I mentioned, and not in Hebrew. And whatever was the case many, many years ago, Beta Israel did not have Hebrew in the 19th century when they were greeted by Westerners or in the 20th century. So they had access to Giz. This is the same text that was used by the Christian Ethiopians, although of course without the New Testament. Forgive me, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, not Hebrew, I guess, but the Jewish Bible of Ethiopians contains some different books than the Tanakh of rabbinic Jews. It includes some books that rabbinic Jews consider apocryphal. So it contains books that you may know about, like Jubilees or the Book of Judith, that are not recognized as Mikra by rabbinic Jews, but are certainly known as important historical works of the Jewish people, non-canonical works. The process of canonization is itself a very interesting question, and how that takes place. Throughout most of their history, Ethiopian Jews were not so much trying to mimic or keep up with Jews outside of Ethiopia. They were trying very hard to distinguish themselves from Ethiopian Christianity, which had a very strong missionary bent towards them, and sometimes not just a missionary bent, sometimes violence. And so the Ethiopian Jewish prayers as well. Professor K. Shelomeh wrote a book a number of years ago comparing the Ethiopian Jewish liturgy to the Christian Ethiopian liturgy. They're very similar, not surprisingly, very similar music. But for me, what stood out, both in her work and in my own observation, is not so much the similarity, but the difference. In other words, they use similar music. Many of the words are similar. But of course, any reference to Trinitarianism has been removed. Any reference to the New Testament has been removed. So this is a community that was struggling very hard to identify itself as both strong and unique and different from the surrounding peoples. I don't know whether I answered that question, but if not, feel free to re-ask.
Thank you very much. Yes. Is there a difference between the different Orits, or are they all the same?
Well, that's hard to know. There are differences between different Sifrei Torah. And, some of these are differences that have been passed down in different communities. Sometimes it's just differences because a mistake entered here or there. Nowadays, scribes who write a Sefer Torah submit it to a computer scan to find anomalies. But historically, of course, different Sifrei Torah had differences because of human error and scribal error, and there was really no way around that. And sometimes you would catch one, and sometimes it would be enough to invalidate the Torah, but not always. So of course there's variation. Okay, these are handwritten books. These are not books printed on a printing press. They're written by hand. So of course there are going to be variations. Whether there are also regional variations, say between the Jews of Tigray and the Jews of Gondar, that's a wonderful question that I do not know the answer to. And I hope that either Sharon Shalom or Reuven Iyasu or one of these other wonderful Ethiopian scholars will address themselves to that question. I think it's a great question.
Thank you very much. Taffy and a few other people asked, what does Sigd mean, the word?
Oh, so I think it comes from the root meaning ishtachavaya, right, or bowing down. I think that there's a cognate to that in Aramaic, but I'm having a Seeder brain freeze at the moment. Amharic and Gez, by the way, are both Semitic languages, so it's not surprising that there would be similarities with Hebrew and other Semitic languages. But in general, you find that Ethiopic, which is Gez, and Amharic, I don't know Tigrinya nearly as well, are much closer to Aramaic, I think that's called Western Semitic, right, than they are to Hebrew or to Arabic. So for instance, the rabbinic word for prayer is slot, called sloton, and that's the word for prayer also in Amharic and Giz. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there was rabbinic influence. That just means that those languages are very closely related to Aramaic. In early times, in the year 100, 200, 300, 400, Christianity came to Ethiopia around by the year 400, and it was much closer, much earlier than it did to most parts of Europe. Most parts of Europe were still quite barbarian when Ethiopia was a dominant Christian country. But Ethiopian Judaism, of course, or Judaism reached Ethiopia even earlier. And there is evidence in early inscriptions of specifically Jewish forms of Aramaic having influenced Giz. Uh, uh, and linguists can talk about that much better than I can. But in general, you'll find many similarities that don't necessarily mean historical context.
Thank you very much. I am not going to pronounce this name correctly. I apologize in advance, but Panagiotis asked, how many Ethiopian Jews remain in Ethiopia?
Yeah, someone was going to ask me that, right? So this is a subject of some political and moral controversy today. The position of the state of Israel was that the bulk of the Ethiopian community that was still left in Ethiopia came in 1991 in Operation Solomon. And there was an attempt to shut down the Aliyah after 1991. I was in Ethiopia in 1992 and 93 in the compound in Addis Ababa where several thousand people had gathered who did claim to be Jews and were still trying to get to Israel. I believe that all the people I knew then are now in Israel. There's been a process of family reunification or people finding ways to demonstrate their Jewish ancestry and all different kinds of things. And so there's been a steady but uneven immigration from Ethiopia ever since. I think just recently 2,000 people were brought from a compound in Gondar. I think there are probably 5,000 or 6,000 more. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. My good friend Allison Feit is very involved. Her father is very involved in humanitarian work and supporting people there with food and aid, especially during COVID. And privately, I can send people information about how they can donate if they want to. But the people who are still in Ethiopia today are, for the most part, considered to be descendants of Jews whose ancestors at some point converted to Christianity. And at some point can mean many different things. In the early days, it might have meant a parent or a grandparent. As time has gone by, it increasingly means further distant ancestors. But I'm not familiar with everybody's story, and there may be people there with closer connections than that. It's hard to say. The government of Israel, sadly, has never taken a clear and unambiguous position. And as in many policy matters, they've gone back and forth in ways that are understandable, but that have caused some problems. And I'll just give you one example. In the aftermath of 1991 of Operation Solomon, so in 1994, there was an interministerial committee under Minister of Immigrant Absorption, Saban. It was called the Saban Commission. Remember, he was Meretz Chaver Knesset. And they gathered together opinions from rabbis, from intellectuals, from all over the place about how to think about Ethiopians whose ancestors were Jewish, but whose parents or grandparents or whatever had converted to Christianity. And in the aftermath of that committee, they made a decision that had very wide-ranging repercussions that we're still talking about now. Okay, they decided at that time that the people remaining in Ethiopia would not be included under the law of return, for the most part, with some individual exceptions, but that they would have the opportunity to come to Israel under the law of family reunification if they had first-degree relatives in Israel. Okay, now what happened is that in Israel, there was a program for, quote, return to Judaism, which was set up under the auspices of the chief rabbinate, which allowed those people, once they got to Israel, if they wanted to undergo a process similar to conversion, but not conversion, which would lead to them being able to be recognized as Jews. Almost all of them did it. A few people opted not to, but almost all of them did it, at which point they were able to bring their first-degree relatives from Ethiopia. So rather than take the 3,000 or 4,000 people who were gathered in Addis Ababa at the time and just say, well, we'll take everybody and no more airlifts. Now you can apply like you apply from any other country. Instead, a system was created where there's been a constant uh, influx of people from different parts of Ethiopia coming and claiming some sort of Jewish ancestry. I'm not suggesting that they're claiming it falsely. I'm just suggesting that unlike any place else in the world where today you sort of go to the embassy and you present your credentials and they decide whether to apply the law of return to you, in Ethiopia, this is still being treated as sort of mass immigration, and they're not really allowing anybody to come as an individual. So they come in these groups, 1,000 here, 2,000 there. And in principle, the government of Israel has made a decision to bring everybody still in the compound in Gondar, I believe. But for whatever reason, that hasn't happened. And right now with COVID, it's become a question of great concern. They didn't have hand soap. I don't know whether they still do. So there was great fear of what that would mean. So far, I have not heard about massive mortality from COVID, but there is mortality from hunger, poverty, other kinds of diseases that people suffer from. So the question of how many Ethiopian Jews are still in Ethiopia is a question of definition. You have to decide what is your definition of a Jew, and based on that, you'll be able to answer that question. It's not a question that has a single unified answer. How many Jews are there in Israel today? Also, not a question. I'm not just about Ethiopian Jews. How many Jews, period, are there in Israel today? It depends on your definition of Jewish, right? 1 million Russians came to Israel in the 1990s who were not recognized as Jewish by the rabbinate. That doesn't mean that some of them didn't think of themselves as Jewish, or may not have been considered Jewish by other Israelis or by other institutions in Israel. So it's a tough question, and it's not a question I can give a simple answer to. But the majority are in Israel, is what I can say. And the people with a close enough connection to claim to be able to make Aliyah have mostly come already, and some of them are still stuck in Gondar. It's of course possible that there'll be some other village discovered someplace in the mountains. They'll come down. But I think by this point, the people who really wanted to come have already made that claim. And I say that with some trepidation because, these things change. That's as close as I can give you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Taffy asked, have the Ethiopians practiced Brit Milah in Ethiopia?
Sure. And by the way, let me just go back. I'm going to answer these two questions together. I'm going to go back to the previous one and answer the question about circumcision. The Ethiopian community itself is divided about who to include under the rubric of Ethiopian Jews. Right? This is part of what makes it complicated. It's not as if the Ethiopian community has historically spoken with a single voice. And some Ethiopian Jews, in particular those who came earlier, were not happy about bringing people whose parents or grandparents had converted to Christianity, because they said, look, they weren't part of our group in Ethiopia when going was rough, and now they're going to come here, and they were afraid of problems. There's been some movement together, especially in the younger generation of people from different backgrounds from Ethiopia, but the Ethiopian community is still internally divided. And often that division is, do I still have family in Ethiopia or not? Most people who still have family there will claim that those people are under the rubric of Ethiopian Jews. People who don't have family there may be less likely to do so. It's not talked about a lot because it's a subject of great angst inside the Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, with respect to circumcision, so this is also a bit complicated. Yes, Ethiopian Jews practiced circumcision in Ethiopia as far back as we know. By the way, so do Ethiopian Christians. Okay, so this is a widespread Ethiopian practice. Ethiopian Christianity is known as very Jewish in many ways, right? They don't eat pork. They circumcise boys and girls, but that's a different matter. So scholars have debated how to view this. Okay, there's also a tremendous controversy about whether circumcision was always practiced on the 8th day, or whether in certain circumstances it was practiced on the 7th day. There is oral testimony to the effect that in some places, under some circumstances, it was practiced on the 7th day. That may be scandalous to rabbinic Jews, but there were places in Ethiopia where that was apparently the custom. And Rabbi Sharon Shalom in his book has an explanation of why he thinks that was in a way that accords with even rabbinic halacha, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Circumcision was almost universally practiced. However, according to rabbinic law, rabbinic Judaism, someone who was circumcised, not l'shem brit Avraham, in other words, for example, an American who has a circumcision in the hospital, not for the sake of being Jewish, but because circumcision is popular or aesthetic or a health benefit or whatever, when they come to be recognized as Jews, they have to, if the circumcision was complete, they have to undergo something called hatafat dam brit. It's the drawing of a drop of blood from the place of circumcision as a kind of completion, a symbolic completion of the circumcision, now that they choose to be identified with the Jewish community. And this has been a source of great attention. I mean, I've witnessed this. I've seen people go through it. Many, many people have gone through it, especially the people coming later from Ethiopia who have not really had as much of a choice if they want to bring their relatives. But that requirement was dropped already in the late 80s from the Ethiopian community as a whole after the protest of the Kesim. Okay, this also relates to who can get married, right? As you know, if you live in Israel, it's not always simple to get married. You have to go to the rabbinate. You have to prove that you're Jewish, that you're single. I got to run around when I, went the first time. So, you can imagine somebody who has more complicated history or less well-documented history. And so when Ethiopians go to get married, somebody is going to decide whether or not they're Jewish or not, the same way it happens for other Israelis. But it's very fraught in the Ethiopian case because there are some people who are not recognized because they didn't go through the Giur, right? Or they didn't go through the Hatafat Dam Brit. So all of this is complicated and it all gets wrapped up together. And I'd love to come back and talk about that another time.
Thank you very,
especially
very
if you buy me a ticket.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Seeman. There was a request for your email by someone.
I'm happy to provide that. My email is dseeman, DSEEMAN, at Emory, EMORY.edu. If you forget it, just look up the Department of Religion at Emory University. I'm easy to find. Things are busy right now. I can't promise I'll get back to you quickly, but I will try to get back to anybody who writes to me. Are you done, Doron, with what you had to say?
I just pasted your email into the chat room so that everyone can see it. I just want to say Chag Sameach and thank you so much, and we'll see you in our next event.
Thank you. Xavier Yistelin, everybody. Thank you.
I'm going to open the microphones now so that people can say thank you personally.
Oh, great.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Yossi, מה שלומך?
היי, דני.
הבנת מה שאני אמרתי?
חנוכה שמח ראשית, וחג סיגד שמח אומנם באיחור.
אמן.
שמח
אני
לשמוע אותך.
מצטער שזה לוקח זום כדי לדבר איתך.
שמחתי, אתה תמיד מרגש, מלמד אותנו המון.
Yossi, some of you don't know, there's no reason you should know, is one of my oldest friends. And we met when I was a college student. He was a high school student. And we've been in touch all these years. So it's very, very good to see you. Anybody else?
תודה רבה.
אז יוסי, אז אולי תישאר אחר כך ונדבר.
סגור.
אוקיי, או שנשלח לך זום אחר בעידן.
אני יכול להמתין, מה?
בסדר גמור.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Just a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Toda.
Thank you.
בבקשה. בבקשה.
Thank you very much. It was most interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep
Hope
up the
to
good
see you.
work.
Thank you.
Thank you, and much needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, my family. Esther, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Kazriel, people from Atlanta.
Laila Tov. Bye-bye.
Laila Tov, everybody.